And now, here to present the actual films of tonight's bold journey is Jack Douglas.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Tonight's journey is the romantic story of Jack Randall, a young scientist from Los Angeles who sailed across the Pacific to continue his studies of marine life and who found both love and adventure on the way. Mr. Randall took his 36-foot ketch, the Nani, to Honolulu, and there he met his lovely Chinese-Hawaiian fellow scientist and wife-to-be, Helen Au. They fell in love, married, made the Nani their home, and had a little baby daughter. Years later, the young family sailed to Tahiti to probe the mysteries of its coral reefs. Our story begins in Hawaii and takes us 2,300 miles across the blue Pacific to the island paradise of Tahiti, aboard the Randall's 36-foot ketch, the Nani. But before we set sail, here's this message. Ladies and gentlemen, we're here in a lovely home at Malibu Beach, California. Dr. Jack Randall has been called to the University of Miami and the Marine Laboratories of Miami on a special assignment. However, his lovely wife, Helen, has been staying in Los Angeles at the home of Mr. Randall's parents, and she's graciously invited us here for this interview. Hello, Mrs. Randall.
Hello,
welcome to our program series, and I should say, rather, thank you for welcoming us here to Malibu. You know, if your in-laws own this place, I don't think that we can call your husband one of these typical struggling young scientists, do you?
No, as a matter of fact, my in-laws live in Beverly Hills, and this is the Malibu beach home of our friends, Mr. and Mrs. Frank Pearson.
Well, it certainly is an appropriate setting, Mrs. Randall, since most of your very fine adventure film does take place on the wide Pacific. I wonder if you would tell us about yourself, about how you met your husband, how this voyage came about.
Well, I was born in Hawaii, and Jack came out on his yacht to Hawaii, and he was a graduate assistant at the University of Hawaii. And I was also a graduate assistant, so we taught the same laboratory course, and eventually we met.
Is this your first visit to the United States?
I went to Boston University, where I received a master's degree in entomology.
That would, I think, be the study of insects. Well, now, it's about 2,500 miles from Hawaii to Tahiti, a long voyage for anyone, particularly a little daughter such as you have. She's what, 2.5?
2.5.
2.5. Well, now, didn't you have some fears and trepidations about taking her on such a long journey?
Yes, I did. Everyone said we had butterflies in our brains, but I just couldn't stand leaving my daughter behind for a whole year, so we took the chances.
Surely. One final question, Mrs. Randall. Your husband's letter mentioned a friend who was the fourth crew member of the Nani. Would you identify him for us, please, and tell us how you recruited his services for this long voyage?
Well, his name is Norman Baker, and he's from New York, and he's an engineer. He came out to Honolulu on a trans-Pacific yacht, and he wanted to go to Tahiti, so he came to see us, and we liked him, so we asked him to join us.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Randall. And now, ladies and gentlemen, 36 feet to Tahiti with Mrs. Helen Randall narrating her husband's actual films of the sea voyage.
Jack, this is the part of the sea voyage that no sailor likes. The scrubbing and painting and making the boat looking nice.
And you were elected?
Yes, I was elected. It was to be a long voyage, so we decided to take quite a bit of store with us. And we had a variety of different type of food. Lori was the only one that didn't have to do any work. She decided she had to help us with the grease on the turnbuckles.
Did she comprehend what was going to happen, the long sea voyage ahead, Mrs. Randall?
I don't think she really comprehended that she was going because the Nani had always been her home. The day of departure, relatives and friends came down to bid us goodbye in the traditional Hawaiian style.
That's your husband getting all the kisses, is it not?
That's right. He loves Hawaiian goodbyes. As the friends waved goodbye to us, we motored out of our slip into Ala Wai Harbor in Honolulu. Our first objective was the big island of Hawaii. We thought we'd take a shakedown cruise and get there. In case any repairs had to be done, we could do it there before we start off for our long voyage. And see Norman waving from amidship there to all his friends that he had met while he was there.
And how far away is the island of Hawaii proper from Oahu?
150 miles.
Mm-hmm.
The small craft warnings were up, and we decided to raise up sails now. And as we go booming along, and that's Diamond Head in the background. A friend of ours came out in a helicopter and took these pictures of us and sent it to us later.
How many knots an hour does she travel, the
She
Nani?
can do as much as 7 knots with the good wind. Norman decided that he didn't really like this part between the islands. The channel there was quite rough, as you can see. We had winds of about 30 to 40 knots. We're coming into Kealakekau Bay now, on the west side of the island of Hawaii. The water here is crystal clear, and we anchored right off Captain Cook's monument.
Now, he was the discoverer of the Hawaiian Islands, wasn't
Yes, and he called it the Sandwich Islands, and from the inscription there, we learned that he discovered the islands and that he was also killed here at this particular spot in February 1779. We went around to the other side of the island, the east side, and came to Rainbow Falls. It's so called because at the foot of the fall, there's usually a rainbow there. And you see that dark area in the back, Jack? It's actually a cavern that goes in quite far. We took a ride out to see the recent lava flow in the Puna District. You can see the vast devastation to the forest there. It's called the Kilauea Rift eruption. And this was once a fairly good road.
Good grief.
After our repairs and seeing the island of Hawaii, we now decide we start on our long voyage to Tahiti. But first we were to stop at Caroline Atoll, which is 2,000 miles away from Hawaii.
That would be your first landfall, Mrs. Randall?
Yes, and it was 500 miles north of Tahiti. Just as a gag, our friends thought it would be easier for us to distinguish between starboard and port by putting up different colored bottles. Norman and my husband were very insulted on this reflection of their seamanship, so the bottles were thrown overboard with a great deal of muttering. To record the number of miles that we've gone each day, we put over this log. As the rotor turned, the number of nautical miles is recorded on that scale. The night light, when it's erect, the bulb on the surface would light. And the greatest danger in a small boat like this is having a man fall overboard, so we had all these precautions.
You have a very modern galley there, don't you?
Yes, I do. The first week out, we had fresh bread and fresh vegetables and fruit. But as the voyage went along, we made use of our canned stores. And it's surprising how big your appetite became as you were out in sea. Dishwashing was no problem at all by using a pot scratcher, and when the deck is awash, you could just swish off the pots and pans, and I suppose any husband wouldn't mind doing dishes in this manner. My job during the day was to keep Lori out of mischief, and we usually keep this life preserver on her. Sometimes when it's rough at night, she would wear it to bed also. I brought along some educational toys so that Lori wouldn't be bored on this long trip and on this little boat.
Did you have to tie her down at all, Mrs. Randall?
When the weather was rough, we usually tied her to the mizzenmast and just long enough so she could get just to the rail but not over. Jack couldn't wait to go to Tahiti to start his scientific work. He decided he'd make some plankton toads to collect the minute organism that float on the surface of the ocean. Up comes the plankton net. It's a conical-shaped net with a bottle at the bottom to collect little organisms. Jack was quite surprised at what he found in there. He's preserving these little animals with formalin, and he's comparing the hauls during night and day. At night, you find the organism come up to the surface, so you get a richer collection. At night, we hear these thuds on the deck, and when I came up in the morning, I'd find these flying fish lying around on the deck. Norman wanted to do navigating. He had done most of that before. And sunsets and sunrise were the things that enlightened our day while we were crossing the Pacific. And I'd often come up and watch as the sun goes down with the brilliant colors of orange and red.
At what time would Lori go to sleep nights?
Whenever it got dark enough, we'd take her down below and said it's Betty-bye time and she'd have to go down. The squalls were quite frequent, and this was a fairly big one, I thought, so I said, well, I'm going to get myself a freshwater shampoo. Norman doesn't really like this. You can see it was quite cold, but I braved that storm and said that, oh, it feels so good to be able to wash your hair even in the open ocean.
It's even better than the vinegar rinse, isn't it?
Oh, yes.
That rainwater?
Uh-huh. Here comes another squall with the screeching winds and pouring rain. But this time I was smart. I stayed down below, and we left Jack at the helm, and he doesn't look too happy. Usually after a squall, we have some repairs to be made to the sails. Norman is fixing up the sail slides. Taking advantage of the sail when it was down, I tried to strengthen some of the seam parts, which may tear open. As the old saying goes, stitch in time saves 9. Well, I used a sail palm and sail needle, and sewing through that dacron was quite tough. It really should be a man's job, and again, I was elected to do it.
You're winning all the elections, aren't you, Mrs. Randall?
I won most of them. Now that the winds have come up again, we raise all our sails, and up goes the big jib. And the Nani, although it was only 36 feet long, actually carried quite a bit of sail. When the sails are filled with wind, it's quite a beautiful sight. Now here's Jack coming up as King Neptune as we got to the equator. He wore this bowler hat that was given to him by his dad as a joke, and then he had this this mop ear that wouldn't stay up, really. Norman was so proud of his long blonde hair, so King Neptune said, off with it. So again, I was elected to do that job, and I was so sorry for Norman after I got through. It was really quite a close crop, as you can see.
Is this part of his initiation, too?
Part of his initiation to wash out some rags. And he is now paying homage to King Neptune. He was a good sport about it, and now he's a shellback and got his certificate. On a little dot in the Pacific, about 500 miles north from Tahiti, was that Caroline Atoll. Jack decided he'd climb up the rigging and see if he could see the atoll. It being a low island, you really don't have any mountains to point it out. Jack, being up about 44 feet, can actually see it, and he said, land ho! So we were quite overjoyed. Now we can see it from the deck, just a green blob on the horizon.
Thank you, Mrs. Randall. Part 2 of 36 Feet to Tahiti will continue in just a moment.
Caroline Atoll, Jack, proved to be only a small island just 6 miles long, completely surrounded by a treacherous 36-foot boat. Jack and Norman take dinghy in to the lagoon and see what they could find. We came to this first island, and it was a paradise for wildlife, Jack. Norman went in to see what he could find on the island itself, and he saw this tern with its egg.
Were those all tern birds we just saw a moment ago? There seem to be thousands of them.
I'm sure they were all turned. Now, this looks like a tarantula, but it's actually a coconut crab. These crabs are so called because they can actually husk the coconut with their pincers. The natives came out to pay their respects, and they brought out this live rooster and coconut, both drinking and eating type of coconut.
How many natives were there on the island, Mrs. Randall?
There were 7 Tahitians living on the island. They were working copra for a company in Tahiti. They had 2 shacks there with the coconut thatch buildings. And a boat comes here only twice a year, so we gave them some of the things they wanted.
They must have been very happy to have seen you.
Yes.
That's a friendly bird.
Even in this paradise for wildlife, you see that these married couples will also have their squabbles, Jack. Here's a close look, Jack, at the treacherous coral so shallow that even at high tide, we could walk over it for some 50 yards from the shore.
Even at full tide, you can actually walk over it?
Even at high tide, you could walk over it. The broad view of the coral reef separating us from the Nani. After dropping Norman and Jack off, I was to row back to the Nani, and the surge along this channel here frightened me so. But once I got beyond the reef, well, I just rowed merrily back to the Nani.
Now, where was Lori all this time?
Lori was to remain in the cabin all the time when we put in the hatchway so she couldn't come up. By this time, fresh meat was a memory. Unlike the natives, we depended upon the sea for most of our diet. It was no trick at all, and simply throwing the line over the side was a guarantee of a fish dinner. Here's our dinner for tonight. It's caranks, and the natives had told us that the fish here are all good to eat. Norman and Jack couldn't wait to get into the water for their skin diving. They said, "Come on, Helen, you can come in and join us, too. It's very pretty down below here." But I said, what's the use, because the water was crystal clear, and I could practically see everything from where I was standing in the stern of the Nani. I might not be able to see this fish feeding. Of course, Jack and Norman can see them feeding.
What type is that? That's an interesting species.
This is a particular caranx with the characteristic black spots.
Looks like one of the guided missiles in design.
And this is a close-up of a caranx. Among the beautiful corals, you see these striped tangs, or convict fish. Schools of them swing by, and the parrotfish with its parrot-like beak, which they use to nibble the coral. The beautiful butterfly fish, the most colorful of them all, in the coral reef. Norman saw a specimen that Jack wanted, so he speared it, and we not only ate some of the fish that were speared, but Jack also preserved some of them as part of his collection of fishes. Now, Jack and Norman are coming back with their catch, and they brought up this one little caranx. Lori was quite intrigued with them, but when she saw the size of this grouper, she actually crawled away from it.
That was a hasty retreat, wasn't it?
Yes. After 3 idyllic days at Caroline Atoll, it was time for us to pull anchor and make our way for the last 500 miles of our journey. We'd set our sails, and we were off now to Tahiti, our final destination. We're zooming along here at about 5 or 6 knots, and Jack took this from up on the mast top about 44 feet above the deck, and he said he'd never do that again. He got quite dizzy looking down at us. As we neared Tahiti, I saw that Jack looked quite shabby, so I decided to give him a haircut. And we saw the school of porpoises swimming around the boat, which was indication that land was quite close. So Jack said, well, he'll go in and watch the porpoises swim. I was quite worried because I've heard tales about sharks in the open ocean, but Jack assured me that that was nothing to be worried about. He was watching these porpoises, and he said, oh, they really swim in a spectacular manner, and we were not to be afraid because he was sure that the porpoises would not hit the Nani.
Most of them chase the bow of the boat anyway, don't they, the porpoise schools?
That's right. I noticed that after a while that they actually stayed up in front of the boat. The coastline of Tahiti loomed ahead, but although the sky was overcast, the vivid colors of the islands were quite visible even from a mile at sea. We saw this boat coming out, and it must be the pilot boat coming to meet us. So we put up our American flag in the mizzen, and in respect to the French government, we pulled up the tricolor up the starboard shroud.
Now, actually, you need this pilot boat, do you, to get you through the pass, or is this more in the form of customs and inspection?
It's more in the form of customs, and in Papeete itself, they said that a pilot is compulsory to take you in through the pass.
Mm-hmm.
We came into Papeete Harbor, and we had our first glimpse of the town of Papeete on the island of Tahiti. We saw the main street, and the cars and people were going by, and noticed that there were a lot of bicycles going. And it didn't take us long before we got our bicycle, too.
We see them here again. The crowd is collected to welcome you to Tahiti.
Yes. The Tahitians are quite accustomed to boats from all parts of the world coming to their South Seas paradise. But their curiosity was aroused when they heard we had a baby sailor aboard. It wasn't long before we got a plank from the quay to a stern of our boat, and Lori and I went out to see the town. While Jack was getting official sanction for his scientific work, Lori and I decided to take this boat ride to see the various views of the island. We came to this part called Point Venus Lighthouse. And Jack, you'll be surprised what they use to light the lighthouse. It's just a regular gas lantern.
Gee, that's a shame because it does look like a very modern and very beautiful lighthouse.
They just don't have the electrical facilities to have the bright light. This is a monument to the missionaries that came to Tahiti. Driving along the shoreline, we saw this particular area where the waves came into the shore, and it formed the blowhole effect, so we stopped to watch it. The view here is spectacular, Jack. You see these high mountains and these quiet pools. The Tahitians make their living on fish quite a bit, and you see them seining for little bait fish here, which they will use later to catch bigger fish. We came to this marae, a sacrificial and burial area of the ancient Tahitians. They have a little grass house where they place their tikis, and they also have it for their mummies. And the sacrificial altar here is all surrounded by this stone wall. This tiki is guarding the gate into this area, and some of the ancient tikis that the ancient Tahitians used to worship. Here's that mummy that I was talking about, Jack. It didn't take us long to be acclimated to the climate in Tahiti. Lori and I have heard so much about the rivers in Papeete, and so we'd had to go in and have our swim in this freshwater river.
I wonder if she was thinking Saturday night is going to be every night in this place.
I don't know what she was thinking, but she was really enjoying herself. At the head of this river was this waterfall. Jack had his own idea about taking a freshwater shower. It was very cool and refreshing after a ride around the island. They have their ducks there too, Jack. A friend of ours on the right there, Dr. Pierre-John Trook, whom Jack had met, said that we should see a Tahitian hula. So he brought along this friend, Tuamata. Tuamata and I became quite close friends, and she wanted to learn to speak English, and I wanted to learn to speak French. So we had quite a few exchange sessions on board the Nani. She also took me to the various shopping centers in Papeete so that I'll know where to find various things that I need while staying in Papeete. Matavai Bay with Moorea in the background. After 3 weeks in Papeete, we made our way to the island of Moorea, some 15 miles away. Here we were to spend a full year living as the natives do and almost totally oblivious of the rest of the world. But that's another story for another time.